Alan Matthews qui va maintenant présenter à son tour. Donc Alan est professeur émérite de politique agricole européenne au département d'économie de Trinity College à Dublin et ancien président de l'Association européenne des économistes agricoles. Donc c'est quelqu'un de très connu dans nos réseaux d'économistes. Je parle pour les non-économistes. C'est une star de l'économie agricole, on va dire, un people. Bon, ses principaux domaines de recherche sont la politique agricole, l'impact du commerce agricole sur les pays en développement. Il a travaillé comme consultant pour beaucoup d'institutions internationales, pour le Parlement européen, l'OCDE, les Nations unies, également pour des panels à l'Organisation mondiale du commerce. Depuis quelques mois et années peut-être, Alan étudie de très près l'évolution de la législation environnementale et commerciale européenne en lien avec les objectifs climatiques européens et les risques de fuite de carbone. Donc on est très heureux d'accueillir Alan aujourd'hui à cette journée d'économie du carbone. Et son intervention se tient en anglais, mais je pense que ça posera de problème à personne. Trade policy approaches to avoid carbon leakage in the agri-food sector. Donc, dear Alan, you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay, I do apologize that for your last intervention this afternoon, you're going to have to put up with English from me. But I do hope that the topic fits well with what we've heard already in a very interesting day. What I want to talk to you about is sort of trade policy approaches to avoid carbon leakage. So if we were to follow Stefan's advice and to impose some kind of market-based price on emissions in agriculture, whether it's through a carbon tax or a trading scheme, there will inevitably be leakage implications. And how do we address that? Well, what I want to discuss with you is, first of all, just to make sure we all are on the same page with respect to understanding what we mean by carbon leakage. I want to present some of the estimates from some of the recent literature on leakage rates in the agri-food sector. And then I want to talk about what we call this border carbon adjustment mechanism. So BCAM is the acronym in English for this trade policy instrument, which is proposed as a way of, in part, offsetting some of the competitive losses that might occur if you were to impose an additional burden on the European agricultural sector. We'll see that there are some problems. There's a lot of advantages, but there are also some problems. So if there's time, I'll just have a slide on possible alternatives. But what I really want to try to do in my talk is to kind of give you an overview, a sense of the literature, to suggest that those of you who may be working in this field, maybe there's a couple of thoughts that you might be able to integrate into your work, but also to suggest for those of you who are sort of looking for research topics that there's a lot of unanswered questions which really do deserve a lot of further research work. So we have carbon leakage because on an international level we have asymmetrical carbon climate policy. So it's clear, Marc this morning told us that from an efficiency point of view, a global uniform carbon tax would be the most cost-effective way of achieving our reduction goals. But of course that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in part because there are important equity issues involved in sharing that burden. Do we take into account historical responsibility for emissions? Do we take into account the very different potential damage that will be caused by high rates of concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? And in any case, we don't have an international order which can impose such a uniform tax. And we know also that in the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Article 3.1 there explicitly recognizes that there will be a common but differentiated responsibility to tackle climate change. So that's written into the treaty. It was reiterated in the Paris Agreement. So we are always going to have a world in which the ambition for climate policy will differ across countries, whether that's recognized in different carbon tax rates or simply different climate policies in general. However, this then gives rise to a concern that emission reductions in the regulated country may be offset by increases in the non-regulated or the less regulated countries. And we can define leakage as the additional amount of greenhouse gas emissions generated in those non-regulated countries caused by the implementation of stricter climate policies in the regulated country. We can express this as a leakage rate. So this is as the percentage the emissions increase outside the regulated country divided by the emissions decrease in the regulated country. But the key point is that leakage is associated with differences in stringency of climate policies between countries. Now, leakage is just a subset of the fact that we, of course, observe the transfer of embedded carbon through international trade in any case. The graph here just simply shows you for the European Union as a whole the impact of embedded emissions in net trade for the agricultural sector. So basically, this is the difference between the, if you like, territorial estimate of emissions of particularly the non-CO2 gases. You can see the green line there. Basically, we don't observe really any reduction, significant reduction since 2010. The blue line then is your consumption estimate. So that's taking into account the carbon. I use the word carbon to cover also the methane and nitrous oxide, the embedded carbon in international trade. And actually, there's often an argument made that yes, maybe in Europe we've been quite successful at reducing our territorial emissions, but we've simply done that by offshoring our emissions to China and to other countries that are, in a sense, supplying us with the dirty imports that we previously produced ourselves. But actually, that doesn't appear to be the case. It's actually not the case for the economy as a whole, according to the Eurostat calculations. But even if we look at agriculture, we can see that, in fact, the share of emissions that we are importing has actually been falling slightly over time. And I put that down to the fact that actually the emissions intensity of our imports has been falling. So other countries are actually upping their game, largely, of course, through efficiency measures rather than through climate measures. Another point to make is that if you have a free trade agreement, let's take the Mercosur agreement, that could lead to an increase in embedded carbon imports. But because this isn't induced by a more stringent climate policy, it's not actually an example of carbon leakage, although, of course, it would result in an increase in embedded carbon imports. I asked the question here, is carbon leakage always a problem? And it's not really a sensible question to ask because, of course, yes, to the extent that we can reduce carbon leakage, we reduce the overall cost of achieving a reduction in global emissions. So yes, we do want to reduce leakage, but I just want to suggest a couple of cases which might make you think as to whether, it's always necessary to go to zero leakage. So, an obvious one, what if the non-regulated country actually has a lower emissions intensity than the EU? So we're shifting production from a high emissions intensity region to a low emissions intensity region. Is that necessarily a bad thing? How would you interpret a shift in emissions resulting from more stringent climate policy in a country such as the EU, where we give high support, for example, to our beef sector? We have an effective tariff rate of 45%. We have coupled support for beef sector. If climate policy results in a shift in beef production from Europe to, let's say, Argentina or to Australia, which doesn't provide those kinds of supports and subsidies, is that necessarily a bad thing? Or if domestic production is associated with negative non-climate externalities, so water pollution, air pollution, ammonia, and so on. So we know, in any case, production exceeds the social optimum. And then we introduce a more stringent climate policy, which may lead to a reduction in production. is that, again, necessarily a bad thing, something we should worry about? So my argument here is that there's always going to be leakage. So the argument about leakage is not about whether it exists or not, it does. The question is it sufficiently important to actually make us think again about introducing more stringent climate policies? Because, of course, if you have a leakage rate which exceeds 100%, that basically means that, yes, you're reducing emissions in your regulated country, but you're more than offsetting that in the rest of the world. That's clearly, for a global a negative externality like climate change, that simply doesn't make sense. Okay, that policy simply should not be implemented. But how big a leakage rate could we actually live with? You know, what about a 50% leakage rate? That's high, but we're still going to get a reduction in emissions. So I just leave that thought with you as, you know, a zero leakage rate is not feasible, it's not necessary. 100% is or over 100% is clearly undesirable. But, you know, where would we actually end up in between? Let me just remind you of the ways in which leakage can occur. The competitiveness channel is the one that's most widely highlighted, that basically you're going to impose some kind of a price on emissions directly. You're going to raise the costs of that industry, and some of that industry may shrink. And if demand remains the same, then that demand will now be met by imports. So basically production shifts from your regulated to your non-regulated country. There's an indirect channel which in the energy literature, where much of this leakage debate originated, is called the fossil fuel effect. But I prefer to refer to it as a demand effect, because that's what it really is. So the idea is that if we reduce sorry, I'm going to get myself confused here now. Basically, if we reduce let me think of it in terms of energy, if we reduce our demand for energy, that's going to lower the world market price. Yep. And that's going to actually cause an increase in the demand for energy indirectly in the rest of the world. So that's going to offset some of the direct impact of imposing the price in the regulated country. I mention a third channel here, which is not at all addressed in the energy literature because it's not relevant, but for agriculture, this land use channel. So even if you, for example, have a subsidy that impacts on agricultural productivity and the demand for land, so you want to, say, extensivize agriculture through encouraging organic production, or you want to afforest some agricultural land. So it's done through subsidy, so you're not necessarily affecting the competitiveness of the industry, but you're also going to induce leakage because, again, if demand remains the same, that demand will now be met through imports. There's an incentive channel which is to do with the impact of ambitious climate policy in one country on the climate policy stance taken by the rest of the world. And in general, this is seen as negative because it encourages other countries to become free riders. If somebody else is carrying the burden, why should my country make a greater effort? But of course, you could also see this as working in the other way, where if a country takes an ambitious stand, that actually encourages others to actually move along with them. And finally, then there's a technology channel, which actually is a source of negative leakage. So basically, I suppose the best example is to think of, again, in the energy sector, where we developed renewable energy technologies, particularly, let's say, solar energy. The costs of that technology dramatically reduced because we subsidized it heavily in the developed world. But the benefits of that improved technology can now be made available to other countries who can now enter the transition at a much more cost-effective way. Turning then to sort of estimates of leakage in the agri-food sector, and this is a very busy slide, but I've tried to put together a list of the papers that I'm aware of, sort of ranked by date of publication. They're all English language publications, so if there are some French studies that I should include in this, please let me know. And basically, I can give you a study which can show you the leakage rate can vary from -5%, so actually a negative leakage rate, to as high as 111%. So the range is pretty dramatic. Although particularly the more recent studies do tend to suggest that, yes, there is high leakage. It can be anything between 50 to 70%, even possibly higher. And we shouldn't be surprised by the fact that there is variation, because there is no such thing as the leakage rate for the agri-food sector. Before I come to look at the factors that address that, I want to just give you an interesting example of deconstructing a leakage rate, which I take here from the expert group on green tax reform, which was the committee that actually proposed the carbon tax in Denmark. So they did a lot of modeling to look at what the competitiveness, income distribution effects and so on of such a tax might be. So basically, the first column just shows you where they expect the emissions reductions to occur if you were to impose a tax of €100 per tonne of CO2 equivalent. And most of the reduction they find in the cattle sector, so that's both dairy and beef, mainly dairy in Denmark, and smaller amounts from the arable crops, the pigs, and then other measures is essentially re-wetting of peatlands or organic soils. So basically they kind of take you through 5 steps. So step 1, what I call the immediate effect here, basically assumes that you have exactly the same emission intensities in your regulated country, Denmark in this case, and the rest of the world, that you have no possibilities for technical mitigation, and that any reduction in production in Denmark is replaced on a one-for-one basis in the rest of the world. Okay, so under those assumptions, your leakage rate is 100%. So that's what's shown in the first, the column under 1. But of course, there are technical mitigation possibilities. And once you take those into account, your structural effect, which is essentially your reduction in production, reduces to about half of the total. Your leakage rate for the crop and livestock sectors between 50 and 60%, or up to 70 for crops. On average, it's about 52. The third column then is an interesting one, because this essentially takes account of what they refer to as general equilibrium effects. So if you reduce agricultural production in Denmark because of the tax, in a general equilibrium model, those resources move into other sectors. So you have an increase in the non-agricultural sector. So that obviously has some impact on your overall emissions. But also in the rest of the world, they are going to move resources into the agricultural sector. So they're going to pull it away from the non-farm sector, which it turns out, at least in the analysis here, actually is much more emissions intensive than the agricultural sector is. So taking into account these general equilibrium effects reduces further the leakage rate overall to 37%. They then look at the impact of assuming different emission intensities, both in the home country and in the rest of the world. So if we assume that Denmark has a higher emissions intensity, then your leakage rate goes up. But if you assume that Denmark has a lower sorry, the other way around. If you have a higher emissions intensity in the rest of the world, your leakage rate goes up. If Denmark has a higher emissions intensity, your leakage rate goes down further. And then in their final column, they take account of two further changes. They actually use emission intensities from a fairly well-known GTAP-E model. They take into account the fact that you can have consumption changes. We haven't allowed for that up to this point. And they also take into account the fact that the ability of other EU countries to expand production and to take up some of the slack that might be left if the Danes reduce their output is constrained by the fact that there is a limit through the effort sharing directive on the ability of at least some European countries to take advantage and to be able to increase their agricultural output if they are to stay within that constraint. And you can see that that has a small impact. So in their model, they end up with a leakage rate, even though it's a unilateral imposition, it's not an EU-wide tax, it's a unilateral tax, the leakage rate of 21%. Now, you can look at the details of how they calculate that, but what I find interesting is just this approach to decomposing. I think it gives a lot of information to policymakers as to why and where the competitiveness effect may come about. As I say, there's a lot of issues that can contribute to carbon leakage. Obviously, whether the sector is emissions intensive, measured as euro per output. We know that the livestock sector is much more emissions intensive than the crop sector. The ability to shift your tax forward to purchasers, depending on the degree of international competition and product differentiation. And if you're modeling this will be determined essentially by the size of your Armington elasticity in your model. Importantly, the availability of technological mitigation options. Those studies that show you leakage rates over 100% don't include any technological mitigation. So in a sense, they're very much on the conservative side. So once you include some mitigation options in your model, it's not just the options themselves, it's also the cost at which you include them. Most of the cost information we have from these broad European-wide models comes from what's called the gains inventory, which is maintained by IASA in Vienna. But for example, when I look at some of the costs that they imply for certain mitigation technologies, and I compare that to what our own research people in Ireland say, I get very different numbers. So there's a lot of research there simply in terms of understanding the technologies available to farmers and what it will actually cost to introduce them. Obviously, the differences in emissions intensities, the level of ambition in the reduction target, Stefan already has highlighted that. The ambition of third country policies and the size of the implementing coalition. Clearly, the more you can get other countries to move with you, the lower the leakage rate is going to be. The design of the policy instrument, subsidies will tend to give you a lower leakage rate than if you have taxes. You can also reduce the leakage rate by giving free allowances, which we have done in the European ETS. And also how we use the revenues is important. Whether we have complementary demand measures, these general equilibrium effects, and indeed what we actually measure, the scope of the included emissions. So all of these factors are relevant to trying to come up and to compare leakage rates across studies. You really need to understand what exactly has been included behind the figures. Okay, I'm running out of time, I can see, and I still want to get to the border carbon adjustment mechanism. I think we can understand why we might want to address leakage. We want to address it from a producer perspective because there's a competitiveness impact. From a policy perspective, this is an interesting one because, as Stefan has pointed out, there is a debate now beginning in Europe on introducing some kind of pricing system for agricultural emissions. And one of the big arguments from the farm organizations is we can't do it because it will simply lead to leakage and we're going to lose market share. But if you have a trade policy instrument in place, that can help in a sense to mitigate some of that opposition to a more ambitious climate policy. There's an environmental perspective because clearly we need to reduce global emissions, not just emissions in Europe. There's a consumer perspective because we want to try to reduce that consumption footprint of European consumers. And there's also a global perspective because we might want to try to encourage other countries to lift their level of climate ambition, and maybe a trade policy instrument is a way to do that. So essentially, what do we mean by a border carbon adjustment mechanism? We're assuming, of course, that agriculture is already included in some kind of emissions trading scheme, because otherwise we wouldn't really be talking about an adjustment mechanism to offset something. It's a levy on the carbon embodied in the imports from non-regulated countries or countries with less stringent policies, and it's a rebate, potentially a rebate to exports to offset the embedded carbon payments that exporters will have paid. And if we combine both this export and import levy, it's equivalent to actually taxing consumption rather than production. And designing a mechanism is actually the art of navigating between these four different constraints. How environmentally effective is it going to be? What is how much does it offset the loss of competitiveness? How administratively feasible is it to introduce it? And how legally consistent is it with our WTO obligations? It's important to recognize that we already have a BCAM in place. Okay, the regulation has now been agreed within Europe. It covers 6 emissions-intensive sectors, of which fertilizers is important because it has an impact on the downstream sectors in farming. Essentially, it's an import BCAM only to. The importers must purchase allowances at a carbon price equal to the weekly price in the ETS. Doesn't apply to exports, although the Commission has been mandated to look at this in a review system in a couple of years' time. It applies to direct emissions, so the emissions generated by the process of manufacturing, as well as indirect emissions from any electricity that might be used. It also, in principle, covers embedded emissions in inputs used in the production of complex goods. But I still, I must admit, have to understand this. For example, iron and steel is covered. And you can imagine the furnaces and the steel-making process, that's an intensive, emissions-intensive process. But I'm not exactly sure whether it covers the emissions in the actual process of mining the iron ore. I mean, that would be quite a long step. It's actually something I need to check. The tax base is actual verified emissions embedded in imports. We're not using a sort of an EU level. The use of the revenue, which is, as Stefan highlighted, a really important issue, is not specified in the legislation. The Commission has already suggested it wants to use the revenue as part of the own resources for the EU budget generally, but that remains to be seen. That hasn't been agreed. As I say, there's these 4 issues to maneuver between. I'm not a legal expert, so I simply can report to you on what the legal people seem to agree or disagree on. And they generally seem to agree that an import BCAM, so just imposing a levy on imports, could be designed in a way that would be consistent with WTO principles. But that's much less certain if you want to include exports and rebate the allowance price that exporters may have paid. And most people seem to think that that actually wouldn't be consistent with the WTO. The big issue I see is the administrative feasibility. And I'm assuming that we wouldn't be designing a BCAM for agri-food ab initio, we just presumably take the model that's there and extend it to agri-food. So that limits quite a lot of the sort of design options that you might otherwise look at. I mentioned the Fournier-Gabella paper here. Of course, for food products, most emissions are embedded in inputs. And I have a chart here just taken from a database that a Danish think tank prepares, looking at the life cycle emissions from different livestock products. And you can see that if you just look at the processing sector, that's the blue line, actually for animal products, the processing sector has negative emissions. And that's because of the fact that there's waste product which can be used in other sectors. Most of the emissions, of course, come in the orange, which is in the agriculture production, but green, the land use, is also important. So it's a question of, how far down the chain would you actually go if you are designing such a system? It's not just the fact that, for a single product, I think there's a lot of administrative issues. But we also know that food supply chains themselves are very complex. So if you take your pizza, it can be assembled from constituents which are coming from, many different parts of the world. So how would you actually track the embedded carbon in those various constituencies, and also whether in any of those countries from which the tomato sauce or the flour for the pizza bottom has come from, has that country got an equivalent carbon tax and therefore should be excluded from having to pay the BCAM levy. So I think the only thing I can think of is where you have free trade agreements, we need to look at rules of origin in order to decide whether a particular import is eligible for the tariff preference or not. So you do have a system in place which would allow for the countries of origin to be identified. But a BCAM would go further and actually needs to know what is the embedded carbon in that particular factory that produced that particular ingredient, if we are to follow the logic of the existing legislation. In principle, then, in terms of extending BCAM to food, yes, it would be beneficial from the point of view of helping to further reduce global emissions. Less so in terms of offsetting competitiveness effects. There's a very interesting recent article by Norden in Q Open where they model this using the Capri model, and they see some benefit from a BCAM, but it's rather limited, and that's mainly because it doesn't cover the export side of things. Of course, there's also the risk of retaliation. This has not yet been adjudicated in a WTO context. We know that there's a number of exporters have already expressed unease at the existing BCAM, and presumably that would also be the case if it were extended to food. I want to emphasize the points made earlier about the importance of international equity. We're imposing a common policy against all imports. We're not recognizing the principle of common and differentiated responsibility. And it is potentially quite regressive for two reasons. First, at least in agri-food, emissions intensities tend to be higher in the poorer countries, so they're going to pay more per unit of beef exported, for example, but also because there's a sort of a terms of trade effect, that if we introduce a border adjustment mechanism that's equivalent to a tariff, so you're going to get a benefit at the expense of your exporting countries. For time reasons, I'll skip this and just come to my kind of summary. We know, and I totally agree with Stefan's argument, that pricing emissions will be necessary to minimize agricultural emissions in a net zero continent by 2050. But as I've argued, carbon leakage is an argument which is widely used by the farm groups to oppose that step. I think Further work on determining leakage rates would be useful. We have this huge range at the moment. It would be good to try to narrow that and to understand exactly why the rates are what they are. I've argued that a BCAM may be necessary to gain political acceptance for the introduction of a carbon price, and indeed that extending BCAM to agri-food trade would have several desirable effects. It would lead to lower overall emissions. It would certainly help to safeguard, to offset some of the competitiveness losses, but it would lead to a dramatic increase in the non-tariff barriers to trade. In other words, the costs of importing will just, it seems to me, dramatically increase, particularly in the case of complex food supply chains. So there is a real trade-off there between the gains from trade, which are really significant, and the benefits from a BCAM itself. I argue that the international equity effects cannot be ignored. You can perhaps try to address this by recycling some of the revenue to them, but as I say, the Commission wants to keep it for the EU budget. And I do really think this is a very lively issue and would encourage anybody interested to sort of pursue it further in terms of research. So thanks very much, Kelly.
Hi, my name is Alice Boitou. I am a student of the Masters in Environment, Energy and Transport Economics here. Thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask you if you consider that those trade policies to avoid carbon leakage fall under the concept of green protectionism, and if they consider that those policies would break the WTO rules, then could we still apply them? And if we apply them, like, can you talk a little bit about the design policies that could make the policy more equitable for all countries, especially for countries that have less stringent policies? Thank you.
Okay, great question. You really asked a question on my weakest point because this is very much the sort of legal perspective, but I can give you a few pointers. Is such a trade policy instrument green protectionism? It could be, of course, but I think it can be designed in a way which tries to minimize that criticism. You know, the idea is that you don't want to discriminate against countries that are exporting to your market. So in other words, you have to treat the exporter in exactly the same way as your domestic producer. And of course, the second principle is that all exporters should also be treated equally. And I think if you are applying a price, whether it's a carbon tax or most likely an allowance price in Europe, to your own producers, then it would be justifiable to sort of say, you know, this can also be applied to your export to your imports. But Stefan pointed out that in practical terms, if we do introduce a carbon price in Europe, we would probably only apply it to the 25% of the holdings that are above the 80%. So we're not applying it to all producers. So how does that? How do we justify that in the WTO when we're going to apply it to all imports, when we're not applying it to all of our producers? So that is the kind of issue. The issue around the export rebate, I mean, if we were to introduce a carbon tax, the legal experts seem to think you might be able to rebate that because we rebate other fiscal taxes. We rebate VAT, for example. We rebate excise taxes when we export whiskey out of Europe or wine. But if we go for a trading scheme, which is a regulatory instrument, and we will do that because fiscal policy in the European Union has to be decided unanimously, and we can get away with qualified majority voting to introduce a trading scheme. So it's likely to be a trading scheme, and here the WTO is pretty clear. It does not allow you to rebate the cost of a regulation. That would simply be seen as an export subsidy and not allowed. So if we were to go further than the current BCAM and to extend that to a rebate to exporters, then the argument about green protectionism would carry a lot more weight. Great question, yeah.
Hi, I'm Zoé Bélanger from the Agronomy Institute of Rennes. Thank you for your presentation, and I would like to know how we can manage different BCAM, because I think that in the United States and maybe in other parts of the world, there are discussions about forming sort of BCAM for their countries, and if that's the case, then how are we going to manage the different BCAM and how? Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent question. I mean, you're quite right that there are many options to design a BCAM. I'm assuming that if we have one in Europe for agri-food, it would follow the outlines of what we have already introduced for these 6 industrial products. But your question then is well, in that BCAM, there is an allowance for if the exporting country has itself introduced a price on carbon, then that should be recognized in the allowance, the price of the allowance that the importer has to buy. So to kind of make it obvious, if, for example, Switzerland, which is part of the ETS, so it has exactly the same price, so clearly there would be no border BCAM on imports of cheese from Switzerland because they have exactly the same price. But your question is, other countries are not necessarily going to design their BCAM or indeed their climate policy, because they may use a regulatory approach rather than a market-based approach. They're not going to design it in exactly the same way as the EU. So how is the EU going to properly recognize the efforts that other countries are making? And this, comes back again to the risks that we are going to be accused of green protectionism if we don't give this recognition. I mean, there are two sort of approaches to this in terms of international efforts at the moment. One is, I think, through the World Bank and so on, where they are collating information on what they call effective carbon prices. So basically, this is still limited to market-based mechanisms, but it can be an excise tax, for example. If you have an excise tax on fuel, this can be equivalent to a carbon tax. It has the ability to reduce the use of it. But even that approach still doesn't take into account these sort of non-priced ways. So I've seen a suggestion. There's some sort of academic initiatives which try to come up with, if you like, the carbon price equivalent of all of the measures that you have introduced to reduce your emissions. You can understand the only way you can do that is to run those measures through some kind of an economic model which gives you the equivalent CO2 price. And clearly, getting agreement on the right model to do this will be hugely difficult. But I have seen suggestions that, the OECD or somebody like that could could take on the responsibility of actually coming up with, a single number for each country, which represents the ambition that you have in your climate policy. But again, it's part of these administrative issues that I think, in the end could well sink the idea of the BCAM, even though I can see lots of positives to it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alan, for your presentation. Do you think there is some kind of justification or a risk to apply your framework within the EU? For example, take Denmark. If Denmark want to tax, in fact, carbon in Denmark, perhaps there is a justification to apply something in Denmark with respect to Germany or to other EU country. And all your framework can be applied, in fact, to EU member states.
That's an interesting question. First of all, Denmark has no intention of applying it. It's prepared to accept that there will be some leakage. As I've suggested, their own modelling suggests it's actually not as high as some of the other estimates that we have seen. But it gives them a huge incentive, and you will hear them argue very strongly that we need a Europe-wide market price on carbon, because that would help their competitive position vis-a-vis other European countries. So the fact that they introduce it unilaterally it changes their negotiating position within the European Union. You raise an interesting question. Could we impose this kind of a border measure within the European Union? Again, I'm not the legal expert here, but I doubt that would be permitted as under our single market rules, because it would clearly be a non-tariff barrier. And the whole idea of the single market with after the Cassis de Dijon case is that if something is placed on the market in Germany, it can move to France without any additional measures being imposed. So to me, I don't see that as feasible within our single market in Europe, but as with the caveat that I'm not the legal expert. Yeah.